Mama, I'm a criminal. Mama, I'm a criminal.
Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. As always, my name is Anna, and today for True Crime Tuesday, what we are going to be doing is we are going to be discussing a case, and I'm going to go ahead and present the facts of the case to the best I've been able to find, and we're going to talk about whether this is actually considered justified or unjustified. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so the case is going to be the murder of George Floyd. So again, I'm gonna just be presenting the facts of the case and what happened, and of course the aftermath up until now, to go ahead and make a selection of whether or not this was justified or not. So Derek Chauvin, he's 45 years old. He was on the police force for 19 years with the Minneapolis Police Department. He had prior complaints. He actually had a total of 18 prior complaints. 2 of them were closed with discipline and with letters of reprimand, which is basically just like a formal written letter that's given to the officer by his superior. And in that letter, it does let them know what they did wrong in detail, what their punishment is. And this also, I believe it does go into their police file as well. So if at any point they want to change departments, if they want to get promoted, anything like that, that follows them. So the murder happened on May 25th of 2020 when George Floyd entered a corner store. And that corner store was called Cup Foods. And it was an Arab-owned shop, and he attempted to make a purchase for cigarettes. And he attempted to pay for those cigarettes using a counterfeit $20 bill. So the clerk who was working at the time, he was a teenager, handled the transaction. And when George Floyd handed him the $20, the teenager initially thought that the bill may have been fake, considering where the strip on the bill was. When he held it up to the light, it was described as being where normally a $100 bill strip would be. So it wasn't placed correctly, because when you have fake transactions, or when you have like an actual $20 bill, when you hold it up to the light, there's a line, like a strip that you can see. And for 20s, it's like on this side, and for hundreds, I believe it's more on the left side. I used to work in cashiering, so I remember that. But essentially, he held the bill up to the light, and he saw that the strip that was on the 20 wasn't where it was supposed to be. It was where normally a $100 bill would have the strip. But nonetheless, though, he still did end up taking the bill, and the transaction ended, and George left the store. So this store, it does have a policy in place that if an employee accepts any sort of counterfeit money, they have to pay for it. They're either paying for it out of their own pocket, or it's getting taken from their paycheck. So after he realized that it was a fake $20 bill, he thought he would just cover the purchase on his own tab, but then later on he would go to change his mind. So he changes his mind, and he ends up telling his boss, and the boss would ask him to go outside and to find George and to bring him back into the store. And he would do this, but George Floyd, he's exited the store already. He doesn't want to go back in. He tries to call him back into the store like 2 times, and both times George refuses. He doesn't want to go. And at which point then the teen ended up calling. It was either the teen or another associate that was working with them at the time, but they ended up calling the police, since it was protocol to call the police whenever a counterfeit bill was presented. Police arrival. When police arrived at the scene initially, it was just 2 officers. All of these officers have now been fired from the departments. They are no longer working, but they were still officers at the time, so I'll be addressing them as such. Now, Officer Alexander Kung and Officer Thomas Lane were the first to arrive, and they approached George, who was in the driver's side. So Officer Lane would be approaching him from the driver's side, and Officer Kung would be approaching him from the passenger's side. So Officer Lane and George begin talking. They're having a conversation, and at one point, Officer Lane brings out his weapon and points it in the face of George Floyd, and at which point George would go ahead and put his hands on the steering wheel, and when he complied, Thomas would go ahead and put his weapon away. After this, Officer Lane would then proceed to pull George from the vehicle and cuff him. While this is happening, Officer Kung is speaking with the other passengers in the vehicle. But after numerous times of just being told he's just being cuffed, he's not initially actually arrested at this point, he sort of calms down and they take him to the sidewalk. At this point, Officer Lane explains to him that he is having to be arrested for the counterfeit money, and then he asks George if he was on anything. So then both officers take George to the squad car, and that's when George stiffens up and then explains to the officers that he is claustrophobic. So by this point, it's been about 5 minutes since the initial officers had arrived, and that is when 2 other officers would arrive, Derek Chauvin and Thoa. So once the other officers arrive, Derek Chauvin, he would pretty much like take over the scene and become the head man in this. And I find that very strange, considering that everything that I was ever told, even if Derek did have like seniority over these other officers, I was always under the impression, and I've always been told by former police, retired officers, that the main person in charge of this case, or in charge of any case, is the officer who was there first, because they're going to have the most information because they were there first. Anybody who comes after, they have to pretty much take orders from them. So I don't understand why all of a sudden, as soon as Derek Chauvin gets on scene, it's pretty much like his ballpark, and it just doesn't make any sense to me. So at this point, there are 4 officers on scene for one man who is still somewhat refusing to get into the backseat of the squad car, and he's already told officers why he's not comfortable going into the back of the squad car, because he's claustrophobic. So after some time, George starts saying that he can't breathe, and that's when he would make his first remarks that he was having trouble breathing. And so at this point, Derek Chauvin went into the passenger side to get him into the vehicle and have like the other 2 officers sort of like help him get him into the car. So like we have, for example, Derek Chauvin's right here on this side, George Floyd's in the middle, and we have the 2 other officers here. Derek Chauvin's trying to pull him in, and the other 2 officers are trying to push him in. So they get him in the car. He's in the police car now. Not resisting. Maybe resisting, but he's in the back of the police car. Now, one thing that I do want to point out, and this is just my opinion, is that I believe that initially when he was saying that he couldn't breathe, when the officers, not when they had him on the ground, but when he was still up, when they were trying to get him into the police car, even before he made it to the ground, I believe that he was saying that because he was claustrophobic. He was feeling that claustrophobia. And one of the symptoms I found is that when you have claustrophobia, you feel like the walls are closing in on you, and you feel like you can't breathe and that you're running out of oxygen. So at that point, I don't really think that it was like the actual, like, something's physically happening to him. I think it was just the claustrophobia at that point. So he's in the back of the police car, and at this point then, Derek Chauvin would pull him out of the car. He would pull him out of the car and onto the ground. And at this point, George is still handcuffed. So he's laying on the ground, he's handcuffed, and he has 3 officers on him because we get Officer Kung, who's on his back, Officer Lane is holding his legs down, and then Derek Chauvin is on his neck and head. And the other officer, Officer Lau, I believe he was just like controlling the crowd at this point, because at this point we have people who are literally surrounding the area. And I'm not going to talk about them much, but there was a lot of witnesses to this case, and a lot of people who, thank God for technology, were able to record what was happening. So according to body cam footage, George Floyd can be heard saying multiple times, "I can't breathe." At this point is when I think that that was a genuine "I can't breathe," because he has so much pressure on him now and on his neck that it's just hard for him to breathe at this point. Other things that he can be quoted as saying are calling out for Mama, who later in the trial would be his girlfriend, would say that he always called her Mama. So there's not really we're not sure if it was her or if it was his actual mother that he was calling out for. But he also said, "Please." So this man is begging them to get off of him. And Derek Chauvin and the other officers would just respond to him saying, "You're talking fine," which in my opinion, I hate that excuse, because "I can't breathe" means I'm using my freaking last breath to tell you that I can't breathe, to tell you to get off of me so that I can't breathe. Just because of the fact that I can talk means I can breathe is complete bullshit. Officer Lane would then ask Derek Chauvin if they should roll him onto his side. And Derek Chauvin would respond by saying, and I quote, "No, staying put where we got him," end quote. Lane would respond by saying, "I'm worried about excited delirium or whatever." And Chauvin would say that that's why we have him on his stomach. The officers would all stay in their positions from 8:19 p.m. Eastern Time, when they got him on the ground, to 8:27 p.m. when Derek took his knee off of his neck and George was put onto a gurney. In later autopsies, it would show that it took all of 6 minutes for George Floyd to be murdered. Because from 8:19 to 8:24 p.m., George was still somewhat moving or showing some signs of life. At 8:24, he stopped moving. A minute later, when Officer Kung went to check for a pulse, he couldn't find one. And all of them still continued to stay on top of this man. Until 8:27 p.m. when ambulances arrived, Derek Chauvin had his knee on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And 2 minutes and 53 seconds of that, he was already non-responsive and possibly dead. It's really hard for me to keep my opinions out of this like I want to do, because I want to give you just the facts themselves so that we can determine if this was justified or unjustified. But it's really hard for me to do. The aftermath. This case would draw media attention from across the nation and start a BLM, or Black Lives Matter, summer of protesting, calling for the arrest of the officers. Derek Chauvin, Thomas Lane, Alexander Kung, and Tu Thao would all be arrested and charged. Derek Chauvin would be charged with 3 counts. 1 count, third-degree murder, 1 count, second-degree murder, and 1 count of second-degree manslaughter. The other 3 officers would be charged with second-degree manslaughter and aiding and abetting. Derek Chauvin would be tried separate from the other officers, whose court dates are actually set for August 23rd. Derek Chauvin's trial would start on March 29th and would go on for 3 weeks, ending on April 20th of 2021. Derek Chauvin would be found guilty on all 3 charges, and his sentencing is scheduled for June 25th. At sentencing, it could be very well possible that he could face up to 40 years for second-degree murder, up to 25 years for third-degree murder, and up to 10 years for second-degree manslaughter. That could total up to 75 years in prison. However, there is one thing that we all have to keep in mind, and that is that even though Derek Chauvin has so many police complaints, he has no criminal record. With him being a first-time offender, the judge may, and I say may, show some leniency. We'll find out his fate on June 25th of 2021. The latest, though, Derek Chauvin's attorney filed a motion for a new trial, claiming allegations of mistakes made by the judge, Peter Cahill, prosecutorial misconduct, juror misconduct, and as well as witness intimidation and impact of publicity. Whether this gets thrown out or not, it is definitely something that, because of some of the jurors that were in the case and because of just comments that were made by politicians, people in power, it could happen or it could be thrown out. At this point, we will just have to wait and see. So I've given you the facts of the case to the best of my ability. What do you think, though? Do you think that it was justified, or do you think that it was non-justified? Go ahead and leave me a comment down below and let me know. In my opinion, it was completely unjustified because he didn't have to die. The other 2 officers, in my opinion, didn't even need to be there because they had it under control when they got there. So why were you even there? And just a whole lot of other stuff. Like, I understand maybe putting your, holding down his legs, possibly holding down his back, but do you really have to hold back the man's freaking neck? Do you really have to hold down the man's neck? No. George Floyd, even though he may not have been an angel himself, he didn't deserve what happened to him. Rest in peace, George Floyd. Alright guys, so I'm going to go ahead and end the video here. Go ahead and drop me a comment down below. Let me know what you think. If you like the video, don't forget to subscribe. And I will see you all soon. Bye.
Mama, I'm a criminal. Mama, I'm a